Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan and observations from the piloting lab. I'm the director of perspectives of heading the German office located in Freiburg. I will today co-moderate the webinar with my colleague Lydia from the German Ministry for Environment. Lydia?
Yes. Hello, everybody. This is Lydia. Thank you, Stefan. I'm working with BMUs, and since the first scratch, I accompany the project, the Climate Finance Innovator project. And this project is funded by the Federal Ministry of Environment on behalf of the International Climate Initiative. And for those that have not yet heard about this initiative, I will say just a few words. Since 2008, the International Climate Initiative, also called ICI, has been financing climate and biodiversity projects. And those projects are taking place in developing and newly industrializing countries, as well as in countries in transition. And the initiative places clear emphasis on climate change mitigation, adaptation to the impacts of climate change, and the protection of biological diversity. And on the ICI webpage, if you want to know more about the projects, you will get a great diversity of the projects. Well, the ICI always is searching for innovative approaches and the project types. And the approach of the Climate Finance Innovator project to us seemed to be very innovative and also very necessary. And Stefan will tell you what is so, let's say, special about the project. Stefan, if you want to give us a short overview what the project does and what it aims.
Thank you, Lydia. So the Climate Finance Innovators project, as Lydia has said, has been supported by ICI. We are very grateful for that because it allows us to do a really comprehensive effort over 3 years' time. The project has started in 2018 and will last through 2021. Perspectives is coordinating the project together with our partners from Climate Focus, AERA Group, Carbon Africa, Énergie Environnement Afrique, and South-South North. Together, we have several foci of work. We are working in 3 focus countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, namely Ethiopia, Uganda, and Senegal, to develop specific climate financing proposals. But the entire effort is more comprehensive than that, and it originates from the starting point that over time, carbon market reforms, specifically in the Clean Development Mechanism, led to substantial improvements in how the rules of these mechanisms have allowed African countries to have more activities, in particular through programmatic approaches that support decentralized technologies with high sustainable development impacts, for instance, rural electrification, etc. But these really important initiatives struggled to get much needed financing due to the crash of the global carbon market. And now a key objective of our project is to support selected funding proposals for high quality initiatives that originated from the carbon markets, but now are also looking elsewhere for other sources of climate finance. And at the same time, because we are in such a transition period from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, we are also contributing to elaborating this Paris Agreement rulebook through negotiation, analysis, and support, as well as in-country capacity development in those focus countries that I just mentioned. So the study that will be presented in this webinar and the webinar itself are part of the work on knowledge projects as part of this project. And we really welcome your feedback a lot since our project is still in its first half, and we are very much interested in also learning about your responses on our work. Exactly. So much on the project for now. And Lydia, back to you.
I'm sorry, we are not hearing anything. Maybe Lydia, you are still on mute.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello, do you hear me now? Okay.
Now we can hear you, Lydia.
Technology. Okay, yeah, the internet somehow is a bit having a struggle. I'm sorry. Well, before we start with the presentations, I would like to give you a short overview of some housekeeping points, as we have a great number of participants. By now, we are about 70 people online. So please stay muted so we all have a good opportunity to hear each other well. During the presentations, you have the opportunity to ask questions via the chat function. We will collect these questions, and after the presentations, there will be the opportunity to raise the questions, and we will read them, and then the presenters have a chance to answer them. So that's why it is also important that you please indicate for whom the question is, for which of the panelists you would like to answer the question. I also highly recommend to have short questions. Also, you have the opportunity to make comments after the presentations. For that, you can indicate wish to have a comment with a little hand that you can click on next to your name. And we will have a speaker list and make sure that comments can be made. But also here, I recommend to make short comments. Also, the webinar will be recorded, and the link for the YouTube channel will be shared at the end. And the presentations also, as well as a short abstract of the webinar, will be shared on the project webpage, which link also you will find at the end of the webinar. So what expects you now? We will have two presentations. One is about the overview of Article 6 negotiations and looking ahead, and the second presentation will be about observations on Article 6 and piloting activities. And the two presentations will last about 35 to 40 minutes. Our first panelist is Aglaya Espelage, and she is an expert on carbon markets on Article 6 and piloting activities, and she's based at the Perspectives German office in Freiburg, and she focuses on background research on international climate negotiations, and as well as providing advice to UNFCCC delegations and host country institutions on Article 6 readiness and CDM transition. And in particular, she's working in the Francophone Africa and Latin America. So I would like to give the floor to Aglaya. And Aglaya, it's your floor.
Thank you very much, Lydia. I will try to give a short overview on the status of negotiations of Article 6. Of course, from a history point of view, there's been a long time of discussing these new ways of international negotiations through carbon markets, but also non-market approaches in UNFCCC negotiations, which had now a new impetus with the adoption of the Paris Agreement and the Article 6, which now lays the groundwork for this new generation of mechanisms on approaches to international cooperation. So if we have a quick glance at the agenda of my short presentation. So first, I will give a very, very brief overview on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. What do the different articles say? What are the key principles? And how is it embedded in the wider Paris Agreement rulebook, or emerging rulebook, let's say. Then I will shortly focus on what are features of these new market-based forms of cooperation that are in Article 6 that we can already see in the negotiations. Although, of course, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. We get some glances at what changes and what will be key characteristics of future cooperation. Then I will talk about the still open issues and give a quick outlook at COP25, where we hope we will get the rule book for Article 6. Okay, so now for the quick introduction on Article 6. The next slide, please. So, yes, thank you. Well, Article 6, usually we talk about 3 of the sub-articles. So there's the Article 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. These 3 articles describe 3 distinct modes of international cooperation under the Paris Agreement. So there is a guidance to be established at the international level for parties to cooperate bilaterally, multilaterally, and transfer mitigation outcomes. And so this guidance will then then establishes the oversight on these transfers, but to some extent also on the modalities of cooperation by the parties as such. At the national level, of course, this will be then used to implement nationally determined contributions, and accounting will be done at some form to the national emissions balance or inventory, and like the balance will be derived from an inventory. Under the Article 6.4 mechanisms, one can register projects. It will be a UNFCCC-led mechanism, a successor to the CDM, if one wants to put it like that, where activities will be registered and credits will be issued for the mitigation outcomes achieved. Most likely, transfers will be then accounted for if they occur between parties under the Article 6.2 guidance, although this is still something up to negotiations and to what extent and the exceptions and so on. Then there's the Article 6.8 work program, which is meant to complement market-based forms of cooperation by non-market-based forms, and which aims to enhance synergies and promote modalities of cooperation that promote sustainable development, mitigation, and adaptation, and enhance resilience. So this is why here we mark on the national level that this will be a work program that will have some links to countries' NDCs, NAP, sustainable development strategies, and so forth. What is clear now that not only that while Article 6.2 and 6.4 seem to focus on mitigation, it is the goal that it also fosters adaptation, for instance, through a so-called share of proceeds that will go to the adaptation fund to enhance resilience in developing countries. Okay, so if we now go to the next slide, we can see that, of course, Article 6 is embedded in a wider context of the Paris Agreement rulebook. I will wait. Okay, thanks. So, of course, Article 6 is meant to be one opportunity for parties to cooperate to achieve their NDCs, either to attract finance for, let's say, conditional targets of the NDCs, or also to find flexible modalities to achieve the own NDC in a cost-effective measure. And they will report if they intend to use NDCs, and also how they used NDCs in the context of their NDCs, which will be updated every 5 years or 10 years. Then parties within the context of the transparency framework will report on their activities and account for their transfers. These are the most important links, I would say, in the current negotiations as well. They're the link to how NDCs are being formulated and developed, but also to how the accounting works. However, of course, there is a broader framework to this. So cooperation under Article 6 and will be a part of the global stocktake. And the idea is, of course, that Article 6 also really supports countries in moving towards the long-term target of the Paris Agreement of reaching, of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, or pursue all efforts to do so. And of course, Article 6 is also a tool for parties to mobilize climate finance. And it will have to be accounted for and differentiated from other forms of climate finance if transfers of mitigation outcomes occur and are used by another party towards the NDC. Also, finance for adaptation will be mobilized, which will then go to the adaptation fund, as I already mentioned. Okay. So now, if we go to the next slide, we already see some emerging features about how these future modalities of cooperation will look like. I will focus now on the market-based cooperation, as it is also the focus, or the more important focus of the ICI project. So the guidance on cooperative approaches, which is being negotiated, will implement rules for the transfer and the recording and the accounting of mitigation outcomes that are exchanged internationally, and may also to some extent give guidance on the underlying activities which lead to these kind of mitigation outcomes to be created. For instance, give guidance on how to report on these activities, which principles should be implemented when designing these activities with regards to baselines and link to NDC and so forth. It is also clear that this accounting will be done through what is called corresponding adjustments, meaning that if one mitigation outcome is transferred to another country, the country that uses it will deduct the mitigation outcomes acquired from its emissions balance, and the country which sold or exported the mitigation outcome will have to add it. This is what we call corresponding adjustment. It's a very technical issue. There's a lot still open questions surrounding these technicalities, but this is the core principle of accounting. It seems also to be rather consensual in the negotiation room that the international oversight on these cooperative approaches implemented bilaterally or multilaterally will be mainly assured through a reporting and review cycle, meaning parties reporting, and the information will then be reviewed by a so-called Article 6 technical expert review, which is linked to the broader framework of the Article 13 technical expert review, meaning the broader transparency framework infrastructure, where regularly information submitted by parties will be assessed. Now, with regards to the centralized Article 6.4 mechanism, this is a mechanism that will be under the authority of the CMA, meaning the Conference of the Parties, serving as meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, and governed by a supervisory body with a support structure from the UNFCCC Secretariat. And in that regard, much like the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. However, what we see, due to the fact that now all parties have NDCs and have to implement these NDCs and report on them, is that there will be a larger role for host parties in these mechanisms, linked to accounting, reporting, and maybe even governing the mechanism. So this is something where negotiations have not yet concluded on, but what is an important new feature. We can also see that this mechanism, as I already evoked many times, really builds on the experiences with the Kyoto mechanisms. However, that the extent to which and how these old mechanisms or parts and elements of these mechanisms can be transitioned into the new one are still unclear. So initially it was planned to have a rule book by COP24 in Katowice. This, however, did not materialize because it's an issue in negotiations which is highly technically complex, but also politically very contentious, and also dependent to some extent on some external decisions to be taken, for instance, in the context of the transparency framework. So in the end, in Katowice, we did not have an agreement on that. Ideally, we would have such a rulebook now by COP25 or at COP25, but there are still some key crunch issues that should be resolved before. So if we go to the next slide, this is a graphical representation about how contentious topics are right now. It's just meant to be an overview. I don't want to go into details here because it's a very complex issue and I would completely get lost in the details. But what is clear is that we still have a lot of issues in the red circle, let's say the most contentious one, which mainly revolve around accounting, but also to the implementation of such key principles such as the overall mitigation of global emissions. And yeah, I would leave it like that, and I would dive into some, in my view, key crunch issues in the next slide. So what we see, what is still an open question under both Article 6.2 and 6.4 is how to reconcile, let's say, a certain harmonization at an international level with the high diversity we see in countries' NDCs and approaches to climate action. And one of these questions is if trading of mitigation outcomes will also be allowed for units and amounts that are expressed in other metrics, meaning renewable energy units or megawatts of installed capacity, energy efficiency standards, and so forth. And that can be accounted towards targets in NDCs that are expressed in that way. And however, there are some challenges around this on the comparability of units that are then transferred at the international level and so forth. So this is one question. Another issue is that parties have different understandings of one of the principles that are evoked in Article 6, more specifically in Article 6.4, which is called the overall mitigation in global emissions, which some interpret to be a result of having an environmentally integral approach to cooperation. Others see it as something that can be achieved through overly conservative crediting, meaning to be very conservative in the assumptions before assigning mitigation outcomes to a certain activity, so that one can be very sure that part of the mitigation is only captured by the host country and not transferred outside of it. Whereas others think that there should be some mandatory cancellation of a part of the mitigation outcomes achieved, and which can neither be used by the host party nor by the buying country. So this is one problem, that we do not have a common understanding of this principle. The next problem is that it's not clear if it applies only to Article 6.4, the mechanism, or also to any form of cooperation that is pursued under the Article 6.2. Another problem which is closely linked to this is the share of proceeds. Share of proceeds being a form of levy on transfers of mitigation outcomes, for one, to finance administrative expenses, for instance, in the context of the Article 6.4 mechanism, the registry, the governance board, and so forth, but also to finance the adaptation and go to the adaptation fund. There are not only different ways how to implement this technically, it is also a political question if this will be extended to Article 6.2 transfers or to only some part of forms of cooperation that are pursued under 6.2 or to all. More specifically, what is still an open question under Article 6.2 and will affect the design is, for instance, how the accounting should be done if an activity that is being implemented in a country is not part of its own NDC. So how will the adjustments be done if the country has achieved its NDC targets and not? And also to ensure that there is no perverse incentive, the countries do not keep their NDCs rather limited sector-wise to be able to export a lot of mitigation outcomes. And another really related question is, can a country export mitigation outcomes to non-parties to be used for other purposes, for instance, by airlines in the context of CORSIA, which is the carbon offsetting scheme for international aviation, or to companies who want to do something voluntarily and want to claim carbon neutrality of their actions. How should this be accounted for if it's a non-UNFCCC framework under this, if this export happens, and is it allowed at all? Article 6.4 negotiations are a bit different because it's not a guidance. It's the setup, the rules, the modalities and procedures of a specific mechanism. So key questions here that are still negotiated is, how will baselines be set? How will additionality be demonstrated? Is it the same additionality principle we know from CDM times, or do we have to add new requirements to ensure that mitigation outcomes that are credited under 6.4 go beyond what a country was planning for the NDCs or not? So these are key questions of design here, which will, of course, determine how much mitigation outcomes can be credited or in which ways the mechanism can be used. And another really key question here, which is also very central to what we do in this project, is how can we design this transition from especially the CDM to the Article 6.4 mechanism, meaning the transition not only of units, what we do with the units of the CDM under the Paris Agreement, but also what do we do with the activities, and particularly with those that run in danger of discontinuation. What do we do with all the methodologies that were developed under the CDM? And what can we do to ensure that the transition is easier for countries regarding accreditation standards and institutions and so forth? So I would say these are really some of the key questions that are still open and which are really important because they will affect very much how international cooperation can look like in some years. So if we now go to the outlook, it is clear that we all hope that by COP25 in Chile, we do agree on a rule set for Article 6. And yes, I tried to quickly show it. There's still a long way to go here, although there was some progress at the last negotiation sessions. A lot of important political and technical decisions are to be made here, so that when parties update their NDCs by 2020, they can clearly mark how they intend to use Article 6 and have some clearer picture of this and can really implement Article 6, pilot it, but also really scale it up in the first NDC implementation period, so that after some time we can conclude with the last details of the rule book. Of course, there will be an ongoing revision process, but at least it is clear that some details will be negotiated after COP25, and in 2023 with the first global stocktake, they can really learn some first lessons from it and see how Article 6 can best support the long-term vision of the Paris Agreement. So with that, thank you very much and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Aglaya, for this comprehensive overview. What about Article 6 negotiations and what is still ahead of us? I would like now to have a closer look what is happening on the ground. Sandra Greiner, who is a lead consultant at the Climate Focus based in Amsterdam, who is engaged in international negotiations on Article 6, like, for example, Gambia, and she's also a technical advisor in several projects that focus on Article 6 readiness, especially in the African region now, will give us a short overview of the study that Stefan mentioned in the beginning of our webinar. This study actually is already the second edition. The first edition was launched in March this year in Africa, and it was quite interesting that the audience received it with high interest. The project then decided to create an update on the study and the content, because it seems to be the case that the Article 6 community is actually having a great interest in having knowledge about Article 6 and its piloting activities. So please, Sandra, it's your floor, and we are always very interested in what the study is going to tell us.
Well, thanks a lot, Lydia, and hello, everyone following our webinar. So I would like to continue now to Aglaya's presentation on some observation on what's happening in the space of Article 6 pilots. More specifically, I would like to trying to move to the next slide. Yes, this is working. I hope you can all see my screen. I'd like to introduce a study on Article 6 piloting, moving towards next generation carbon markets, it is called. And well, the key objective, first of all, of this study was to compile information on what's going on, because there were, or there already are, a number of initiatives springing up that try to implement Article 6 on the ground. So this study seeks to be a sort of compendium, has fact sheets on the different Article 6 pilots that currently exist. And secondly, we also try to look at some of the trends that we can see, also particularly as they relate to the crunch issues being negotiated under the UNFCCC. So that's what the study intends to do. I'm going to give you a closer look at some of these key messages that we found. And as Lydia said, the study was first presented during the African Carbon Forum in Accra earlier this year, and then we had a relaunch during the Innovate for Climate in Singapore. First of all, just some high-level observations from the study. We found that while, of course, Article 6 negotiations are still ongoing, it is already real in that sense that action is happening on the ground. We have calculated that among the pilot initiatives, $345 million have been allocated towards Article 6 initiatives. These initiatives are really very diverse, and many of them take more aggregate perspectives, so they move towards sectoral or even policy level interventions. And with that, we see that while, of course, there are a lot of similarities to carbon markets under the Kyoto Protocol, the CDM and JI, there are indeed quite some differences to the carbon markets of the past. And in particular, the Article 6 pilots seek to anticipate the emerging features under Article 6. But what actually is an Article 6 pilot? And that's a question that our consortium spent some time trying to resolve or to find a definition. When you think of pilot concepts, you would say it's something to test a concept before you start a real rollout. Starting with that, we reflected and we thought that well, Article 6 pilots in particular are broadly those initiatives that will align themselves with the 3 sub-articles of Article 6. But we were still not clear about a working definition. So what we propose in the study and what we used as key indicators is basically to say that, well, an Article 6 pilot is something that the initiators of this initiative think of as an Article 6 pilot. So it is framed as something that seeks to be an Article 6 pilot. We also defined as key indicator that once the Article 6 rules are finalized, this initiative would most likely be governed by the rules. And a third key indicator, we found that the initiative clearly has an intention of parties to exchange ICMOs at some point. So with this definition, we identified basically 10 pilot initiatives. And you can see the list on your screen. Quite a number of them are led by development organizations, multilateral development banks. You have the adaptation benefit mechanism of the African Development Bank. You have the integrated carbon program for the Southern and Eastern Mediterranean from the EBRD. You have 2 initiatives from the World Bank, the Standardized Crediting Framework, or SCF, as well as the Transformative Carbon Asset Facility, TCAF. And the other big group of pilot initiators are governments. So for instance, you have the cooperation between Canada and Chile. You have the Japanese Joint Crediting Mechanism, or JCM. You have virtual pilot studies from the Swedish Energy Agency, and you have 2 purchasing programs from Switzerland, being the Climate Sen Foundation and its successor, the CLIC Foundation. And you can see in terms of volume of funding that there are really 3 heavy weights in the initiatives right now, which is TCAF, JCM, and the Swiss pilot initiatives. And there are a few of these pilot initiatives we included which are actually not planning, or at this moment committing any funds towards the purchase of ITMOs or emission reductions, but they are more at the stage of operationalizing conceptual studies. Those activities, of course, right now do not have substantial amount of funding. We also found that there are some initiatives which are related, which are perhaps not a real pilot because they never intend to actually transfer any ITMOs, but they are focused on supporting initiatives, or they are on capacity building, on providing the infrastructure. So in our pilot study, we also feature some of these initiatives as related initiatives, where we're not quite sure yet if they will turn out to become an ITMO transaction in the end. And of course, so this is really in flux and certainly not exhaustive. There are some other initiatives which we also talked with, and that maybe coming up in a later edition of this study and could be included. So if you look geographically at the distribution of these pilots, I think you can see that it's quite well represented. So we're looking here now at the individual projects that are supported by the individual initiatives. And you can see that perhaps unlike the CDM in its early days, it's also Africa and low-income countries are quite well represented in this pilot landscape. And adding to that, the recent tender by the CLIC Foundations, we couldn't include it within our pilot study because of the time of writing. It was still ongoing, but it also points into a similar direction, that it's quite evenly spread between countries, which is nice, of course. And with that, I would now like to turn to basically the design aspects of Article 6 and coming back to the emerging features that Aglaya mentioned in her presentation. as we also looked at now how are actually the pilots dealing with these new challenges arising under Article 6. We specifically looked at Article 6.2 and 6.4, where the majority of pilots fall under. There's one initiative under 6.8, which is the adaptation benefit mechanism. For the rest, the pilot initiatives either pursue an Article 6.2 route, or they are instrument neutral, so they say, well, let's see where we fall under. We keep it open for the time being. But if we look at so some of the emerging features that will have to be addressed, you can see here a summary of those. Of course, the biggest novelty compared to carbon markets of the past is that you need to avoid the double counting. Well, that's particularly true, of course, for the CDM. JI, you already had to have a similar situation, but the rules pertaining to the avoidance of double counting are very new. There will be reporting and accounting involved of ITMOs, as Aklaya explained. Another aspect that we found is that the cooperation has many more degrees of freedom in a way to be defined. So what constitutes the activity as such is quite open, and Article 6 at the moment is not limiting, not particularly limiting. We also see an increased role of governance in these transactions, and I will come to that on the following slide. Then we see in the area of baselines that the key questions that are being raised in the negotiations is how do we deal with the fact that we have NDCs and we have the overall decarbonization goals of the Paris Agreement. So how can the baselines basically cater to that? We have the new requirement under Article 6.4, possibly 6.2, to have an overall mitigation of global emissions, so that the idea is to not just exchange emission reductions, but to have a net positive effect for the atmosphere. And lastly, another key emerging factor that we at least see in the negotiations is that there's a lot of attention to not just mitigating CO2 or other greenhouse gases, but also contributing to sustainable development, having a relation to the UN's sustainable development goals. So we look in our study how these things are being approached by the pilots, and I would just like to share with you some select observations relating to that. The first one, as I said, is that we find governments really do play a key role in these Article 6 pilots. We see that in Article 6, the role of governments, and particularly host country governments, is that there needs to be an authorization of transfers, because through the NDCs, any emission reductions achieved in the country also have the nature of a national asset. So, of course, if you transfer those abroad, you need to very carefully evaluate what you're transferring. Governments will also have to report and account for any ITMO transfers, doing those corresponding adjustments, which have not actually taken place yet, but the Article 6 pilots seek to prepare the groundwork, certainly for that. So we see that in basically all the pilots we analyze, both the buying side as well as the selling side, governments are quite active. we have on the right-hand side the example of one of these transaction structures based on the arrangements by the Swiss Click Foundation. And what is interesting is that here we are going towards basically a two-level contracting arrangement. So you have a bilateral agreement between the governments. You don't, well, this is what the Click Foundation and the Swiss government are working towards. And you have on the transaction level, you have what the term MOPA is currently trending, which is a mitigation outcome purchase agreement, which resembles the ERPA structure that we know from the Kyoto Protocol's carbon markets. Second observation is that basically all pilots are trying to somehow define the relationship with the host country's NDC. We see different approaches. One is that Article 6 pilots seek to establish, for instance, local committees to evaluate how a technology might contribute to the sector or to the climate goals overall. We also do see some attention to the contracts, and particularly the risk that you enter into a contract, but maybe the NDC is not being achieved. So there are some designs of options, or the transfers get linked to certain milestones that are then related to NDC achievement. We already see the sharing of the mitigation outcome taking place in some pilots between the buyer and the seller, so that also the selling country retains a portion of the mitigation outcomes. And last but not least, some of the initiatives seek to limit the eligible activities to only those that are inside NDCs, so where the sector is covered by the NDC, or they are also thinking about conditional, unconditional pledges. So here in the presentation is actually missing an un, so it should be going beyond the unconditional pledges targeted. So what the host country by itself seeks to deliver. So if you should also go beyond the conditional pledges, of course, then you're basically even more ambitious. There's no formal agreement on that, but some discussions within the pilots where these activities could start. The last observation that I would like to share with you is that these pilots are also attempting new definitions of baseline methodologies and additionality. One can say that actually in most cases CDM methodologies form the starting point, but then for instance they are simplified in their application through for instance default values or checklists. There's also in quite some pilots the attempt to move to sectoral baselines. And some pilots are even looking at how you could relate the baseline to the NDC goal as a whole, which of course means that you need to somehow define a trajectory of emissions, and you need to do some modeling, and then you can say, well, maybe this could serve as your crediting baseline. So to conclude, and in summary, we've seen that the pilots are already trying to anticipate many of the Article 6 features, and are developing quite a number of innovative solutions to deal with those new challenges, particularly in the area of baselines, contracting structures. Some are also supporting building up registries. But of course, right now, the number of pilots that we have analyzed is quite small. So we talk about observations rather than clear lessons learned. It's not yet a fully analytically robust result that we have. And we see that certainly in these pilots, the topics, the issue that is most difficult to address is really the relationship with host countries NDC. And overall, also the accounting for ITMOS is quite at its infancy. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I will hand over again to Lydia and Stefan.
Well, Sandra, thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview of activities that are already happening around Article 6 and piloting. I find it quite fascinating that even though negotiations are still going on, already on the ground, different actors already take action and put effort in pilots to see how it could look like and work. And I'm very much sure that insights and lessons learned from those pilot activities go back into the negotiation rooms and are being considered. So for that, I would like to close the presentation section of our webinar and now open the floor for comments and questions. We already have gathered some questions, and I would like to emphasize and invite you again to raise your hands or write some questions because we are looking forward to a very fruitful and vivid discussion. So Stefan, I'm handing over to you now to have the first question interventions. Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lydia. So we have received a number of questions, and while they are largely of different nature, I will try to cluster those questions a little bit that are interlinked to each other. And so the first question I would like to address to Aglaya, although Sandra, if you have any additions, please feel free to compliment, of course. So the first question came from Ritu Ahuya, and she asks whether, Aglaya, whether you could please explain the linkage between Article 6.2 and 6.4. And then we have some related question from Maria, which asks essentially for examples for what conditional NDC targets could signal what additional efforts could qualify as now examples for Article 6.2 or 6.4. Aglaya?
Yes, thank you. So on the linkage, this is of course in the heat of the negotiations a very important issue. So let's say generally Article 6.4 is a crediting mechanism governed by UNFCCC under authority of the UNFCCC. And Article 6.2 is a guidance on the transfers of mitigation outcomes. So one very clear linkage is that most probably if under Article 6.4 credits are issued for a certain activity, that they will be accounted for according to the Article 6.2 guidance when they are transferred. So this is the most clear linkage there is. However, there are some issues in negotiations, some details which are still not clear. So for instance, if under Article 6.4 mechanism, for instance, it would be feasible to receive credits for activities that are being not covered by the NDC of the host country. Let's say it's not allowed under Article 6.2, but under Article 6.4, if then accounting would be according to Article 6.2 or not. So there are some issues that still need that we still need a political decision on. But let's say this is the clearest link. So because Article 6.2 will cover the transfer of mitigation outcomes that come from baseline and crediting mechanisms, be it domestic or in bilateral or any other kind of crediting mechanism, including the Article 6.4. Whereas it can also cover transfers from mitigation outcomes that are achieved under ETS, under linked ETS, for instance, when transfers go across borders. So let's say that Article 6.2 is much broader in that sense that it covers more approaches to achieving mitigation outcomes than Article 6.4 mechanism. On examples, so as Sandra already mentioned, well, conditional and unconditional NDC targets, it's not a term that is being used in the negotiations because it's also not used in the Paris Agreement text on NDCs or any related decision. It can be understood that unconditional targets are the one the country unconditionally commits to, whereas Article 6 can be understood as something allowing countries to implement activities that are part of their conditional targets of the NDCs. This is an understanding which is growing. However, it is not written as such in the negotiation text, but it could be interpreted as well like this in the implementation of Article 6. So, for instance, if a developing country or another country has an unconditional target to reduce emissions in a certain sector by 30% and a conditional target to reduce this up to 50%, these additional mitigation measures that can be considered conditional could be achieved through Article 6 cooperation, either bilateral or through activities registered under the Article 6.4 mechanism. So I think this is a clear understanding we are getting here. However, I don't think it will be forbidden to transfer something that is covered, let's say, in the unconditional part of the NDC. However, of course, then the country that is exporting the mitigation outcomes has to do more inside of their own borders to be able that it still achieves, to ensure that it still achieves its NDC targets. So I think host countries have an interest in really understanding what activities go beyond their unconditional targets and they can be exported without endangering compliance with their own NDC. So, Sandra, please complement if you have something to add.
Thanks, Aglaya. Perhaps just to add to that, I think you explained the concept of unconditionality and conditionality very well. So for me to add is that, of course, the NDCs are extremely heterogeneous. And so what does it mean in the context of individual NDC? What is a conditional or unconditional contribution? Not all NDCs are always very granular. So to really understand how an Article 6 activity might support the NDC goals, you might have to go deeper into sectoral development plans to really understand what is underlying the commitment. But of course, you also have different metrics in the NDC. So not everything is related to CO2, but you might have goals related to renewable energy deployment or the dissemination of household biogas digesters. So when we talk about examples of unconditional pledges, you might, for instance, find in some NDCs that well, 30,000 biogas digesters will be implemented, and with support we could go up to 50,000. Of course, then you need to figure out so which ones would receive the access funding support through Article 6 or which not. How do you structure that into a real transaction? Many questions are attached, but the reality, of course, is that you will have to look at every case very individually and specifically.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Aglaya, for answering the first questions. I would like now to try if I can give the voice to Niklas, who has a question and raised his hand. So I will try to unmute. So give me just a second. Well, I need to ask our technical support because I somehow cannot unmute Nicholas. Joanna, can you support us to give Nicholas a voice, please?
Lydia, in the meantime, Nicholas clarified that he didn't mean to raise his hand.
Ah, okay, good. Well then, Stefan, maybe you can then go ahead with the next question.
All right, I will do that. And just as a reminder to everyone, in case you haven't seen this function yet that Lydia referred to, there's a little hand icon that will allow you to speak directly to the audience, and feel free to make use of that. But in the meantime, we have received a number of written questions already, and I will now proceed with the next one. I think it will address either Aglaya or Sandra, and the question comes from Dimitri Halubowski. What is the expectation for implementation of Article 6 actions happening between COP25 and COP27? Is the expectation only for limited pilots to be implemented during this time frame? And then at the same time, I think we could add the same question, the second question from Fiona Ryan. Is RED Plus likely to be included in Article 6 or not? Sandra, do you want to start?
Sure. So thank you for these good questions. So first of all, whether the expectation is that Article 6 pilots are only implemented during a certain time period between COP25 and COP27. Well, my expectation would be that we will see more of Article 6 initiatives coming forward, being developed at this moment as pilot initiatives. It's a bit of the question how we are calling it, because certainly all these initiatives, they seek to be regular Article 6 initiatives at some point, is my understanding. But given that the rules are not finalized, this is not feasible at this point. So I think that we will just, at some point in time, maybe when the rules are completely finalized, drop the word pilot and just speak of an Article 6 portfolio. With regards to the other question, whether RED Plus is included in Article 6, it is not clear. It's certainly one of the disputed issues under Article 6 in the negotiations, and it depends a bit on the wordings, what kind of mitigation activities or emission reductions or also avoidance or also sequestration will be allowed. My general answer would be if there's no specific provision that will exclude land use projects, RED plus initiatives, it would be included because that's how basically open Article 6 is first of all defined. There are some parties who wish to exclude those kind of activities. So it's a question of consensus building, but it's overall, either the matter of specifically excluding it or having some requirements on eligible characteristics of units or ITMOs that might exclude it. So we'll have to see.
So maybe if I just add one point, because I think the question was also due to my graphic with the outlook onto the next COPs regarding the next time for Article 6 pilot. So I think the expectation and hope would be that we get a robust set of rules on Article 6.2 and 6.4 out of COP25. But of course, some details will be referred back to SAPSA or to the supervisory body of the 6.4 mechanism for developing their rules of further rules of procedure, developing the infrastructure and setting everything up. But the hope would be that, of course, we got a clear understanding how the cooperation can be implemented. And then, let's say, the last details can be finalized by the next 2 CMA meetings. I think that would be the hope and the best case scenario here.
Okay,
maybe I
thanks.
Can, sorry, Stefan.
Thanks
maybe
to
I
both of you. Sorry, Sandra. Yes, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add a thought, because the question was also about limited contribution from Article 6. So that's, to me, an evaluation question. What we are seeing at this moment, is that limited or not? Huh? Is $345 million, is that a small number? Or is that already a big number? Of course, that's a judgment call. I would think that compared to what our hope is in what Article 6 will deliver at some point, it's certainly a small number. But at the same time, it's also not insignificant, even what we are seeing today. So I just wanted to add that point.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that point, because of course we need a lot of investment. But in any case, let's move on to the next set of questions. I think we have 2 more technical questions relating to how the operational modalities will look like. The first question comes from Fiona Ryan, and it asks for new host party responsibilities. Could you give an example of how this would look like? And at the same time, Gwyn Foster asks, is there any consideration about developing local data recording capability in rural areas? So I assume this is a question about prospective capacity development efforts. Any one of you, Aglaya, Sandra? And to the audience, feel free to specify if you would like to get a response from one of the specific panelists, and if not, we'll just take them as we see fit. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start quickly on host country responsibilities. It is clear that just given the nature of NDCs, and Sandra talked about this also in her presentation, countries do have more responsibilities regarding their emissions and how much of their mitigation they do export and how much they need for own compliance. And from this, a whole number of responsibilities arises, such as clearly defining how they want to use Article 6 through initial reports, for instance, through regular reports, what emissions are, what mitigation has been exported, how the mitigation exported was accounted for, and so forth. But and we see this in pilots more in particular, and I think maybe Sandra can elaborate on that. Let's say that the very specific degree to which host country responsibilities go is still up to negotiations, in particular under the Article 6.4 mechanism. So the question here is more about how centralized will the Article 6.4 mechanism be, or will there be some, global international supervision by the supervisory body, but then countries implement the specific requirements in their countries? Or will it be very CDM-like, very centralized with a common procedure for all activities and the same process directly at the international level? So these are a question which are still up to negotiations at some point, but it's clear that especially given this context of NDCs, a whole new array of responsibilities arises, which always departs from that necessity for countries to really understand their own commitments and to make the choice where they want to pursue cooperation under Article 6, in which sectors and to what extent.
Yeah, thanks, Aglaya. And perhaps to add to that, I think in the pilots that are ongoing, we definitely see already that host countries are more engaged than they were under the CDM. So under the CDM, as you know, basically all that was needed was to sign a letter of approval for a project activity. And we can see that host countries now are getting more engaged in validating those assets. And perhaps case in point is the joint crediting mechanism, the JCM from the Japanese government, as well as also the standardized crediting framework by the World Bank, where you really have a very active co-definition of what is the cooperation about, how do you agree on a methodology, how do you agree on a monitoring approach, and where the host country already assumes some of these functions that normally would rest with the UNFCCC, and where we see that host countries are interested in these particular pilots to take on more responsibilities. And related to that, of course, is also the second question: how about data gathering and local data generation, particularly in rural areas? Data is always key. It's always the problem. You never have enough granular data. So these pilot activities, one of the key areas, of course, is to generate more data as they can. I think one issue that is not very clear yet in the negotiations, or at least it doesn't seem to be a requirement for host parties, is whether host parties will have to manage that data themselves through registries. But we see that I think many host parties are interested in building up their own control over data, over through registries, and there are some I think the capacity building support that is offered by the development banks also goes in that direction to try and establish these kinds of processes in infrastructure. And I cannot say if there are already readily developed registries at this point, but it is certainly part of the whole Article 6 pilots.
Good. Yeah, and just a very quick addition from my side. Sandra, earlier you also mentioned the use of default values. And of course, default values are usually the result of such a process to generate sector level data from a certain country and then translate that into a default value. So we already saw that in the CDM, and we also see it now. It's certainly a long-term trend in carbon market methodologies. But this also relates to one of the other questions now that we have, at least indirectly. And in light of the time, I would now like to read all the remaining questions so that we make sure that we answer all of those that have already been posed. And at the same time, if someone would still like to ask a new question, we will try to still fit that in, but I cannot promise that anymore. So now on the questions, Ritu asks from Terry, India, both Aglaya and Sandra, what your opinion is with regards to a transition from CDM to 6.4, whether this will take place, especially for the CERs. And she's asking this specifically from the point of view of India, which has a lot of registered projects and programs and unused CERs. Then Carla Pascal from Argentina asks, what happens with emission reduction transactions when governments establish in their NDCs that such reductions are relevant to countries? How do you deal with investors? How do you enter the carbon market? Nicola asks, and I think I can address this question to Aglaya specifically based on some previous work that I've actually also pasted into the question chat. Countries that reduce the usage of HFC gases, which is a class of highly potent industrial gases, in refrigeration could receive ITMOs, question mark. And then related, is there a linkage between the Kigali Amendment and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement? The Kigali Amendment is an amendment of the Montreal Protocol that deals with the ozone layer. Final question from Elizabeth Philip is basically a follow-up question on the earlier question on host country responsibility, and asks whether there's an obligation for the host country to report if the sector is not covered under the NDC. So Aglaya, Sandra, over to you for the final round of answers. And please keep them also short so that we can finish on time.
Okay, I will make a first step. On the question of CDM transition, it is clear that this is a very contentious issue in negotiations, in particular when it comes to the transition of CERs, as there is a widespread fear that the oversupply of CERs could hinder market development. It is of course also clear that there is a need to establish trust of investors in the carbon market through providing a clear path of transition. So this is really one of the key contentious issues, as I mentioned in my presentation. There could be maybe some compromise around vintage restrictions for transition and so forth, but I do not want to speculate here because this will be one of the key crunch issues until the end, I guess. So now I think if countries establish in their NDCs that certain emission reductions are necessary to fulfill the unconditional pledge of the NDC targets, Article 6 forms of cooperation might not be chosen by the host country governments as the most suitable ones. It would look different if kind of mitigation outcome is considered very relevant, for instance, due to high sustainable development or long-term benefits, but not under the unconditional pledge. Then it would be an activity that would usually be judged to be very suitable for Article 6 market-based forms of cooperation. So I do think that countries need to get ahead, need to get a good understanding of their NDCs and then establish links with investors and really have a strategy how they can implement different activities in different sectors. Now, on the question of the Kigali Amendment, this is a really interesting interlinkage that we see here between the Montreal Protocol and the UNFCCC. And well, we did a discussion paper on that, and I invite everyone to go on our website, perspectives.cc, and look it up under publications. And we do think that there is significant synergies that can be exploited if one would link the implementation of these two agreements, because there is a mandatory phase down path for HFCs in the refrigeration sector, for instance, and there will be some funding as well for that, for compliance by developing countries. However, if we can use Article 6 to drive early action that would kick in before these phase down paths get mandatory for different groups of countries, we can mobilize very significant additional mitigation that is important and can have a great contribution to the long-term targets of the Paris Agreement. So yeah, we think that linking these two by, for instance, taking into account baselines, like the baselines from the Kigali Amendment into the Article 6 activities in these sectors can be really beneficial. What is very clear is that we are not talking here about the large-scale industrial gas projects on the destruction of HFC 23, a category of activities which was heavily criticized under the CDM, because this will now get mandatory under Kigali Amendment. So an important, let's say, synergy between these two environmental agreements is that, as it is now mandatory under one of the agreements, and also costs for compliance will be covered here, it should not be used under Article 6. And we would understand the interlinkage to work in a way that this would be automatically excluded, because it's a requirement for countries, not any kind of additional action. Yes, so well, on the last question, the obligation of reporting if a sector is not covered under the NDC. Well, this is still subject to negotiations and could be part of different forms of requirements to report if it's allowed for crediting of outside NDCs. But of course, the inventories, well, there will be some flexibilities for countries. The aim is that countries report on until 85% of emissions. So there will be some sort of reporting if the sector not included in the NDC is important for the emissions of the country. With this, I hand over to Sandra.
Thanks, Aglaya. I think you've already covered basically a lot of ground. So for me, just want to address one last outstanding question, which is how do you enter the carbon market? It's a good question. And what we've seen from these pilots is that at the moment, Article 6 is basically not private sector driven. It is developed by larger development organizations and governments. So it depends on who wants to enter the carbon market. If we are talking about private firms, I think at this moment Article 6 is quite insecure for private sector investors to start building initiatives. So there's of course still the voluntary market, and that's thriving. Otherwise, it's a question for governments how to promote early learning, early cooperation with partner governments. So I think that's where we are, and it's perhaps important to emphasize as a whole that we are right now dealing with an instrument that is more at a higher level, government development institutions driven. So handing back over to Stefan.
Thank you very much, Sandra and Aglaya. And with that, our webinar has come to an end. We also haven't received any new questions, but we want to thank all of you participants for joining the webinar and for asking these questions. I would also like to invite you to review both the slides for this webinar that we will make available at the Climate Finance Innovators website that you also see on the page right now. And at the same time, we would of course also like you to explore other studies and publications that we have prepared in the context of this project. And finally, we would like to invite you to join our team at COP25 at a UNFCCC side event that we will be hosting, that will also deal with the questions that we've covered today in the side event, in the webinar. And with that, I would like to hand over to Lydia and say goodbye on behalf of our team. Thank you, Lydia.
Yes, thank you, Stefan. Also from my side, thank you very much for attending the webinar and for being patient and also very curious and asking questions. And I enjoyed this experience with you, and I'm looking forward to maybe have another opportunity on behalf of the project to feature a webinar. I'm also very interested in your opinion on the pilot study. If you have thoughts or input, please approach the project. They can evaluate and consider it for the next edition. And if you would like to learn more about Article 6 in general, what is going on, and also what BMU does on this topic, I also like to invite you to visit the webpage Carbon Mechanism. And with that, I also would like to close this webinar. Thank you to Sandra and Aglaya for sharing insights and experiences. And goodbye.